The night was quiet, the kind of shift Officer Megan Calloway didn't mind. It was just past 10 p.m., and the streets of Cincinnati, Ohio, had slowed to a trickle. The occasional headlights cut through the darkness, but the city itself felt still. Megan sat in her patrol car near an empty parking lot, sipping from a now lukewarm cup of coffee, half listening to the radio chatter. Nothing major. Just a couple of routine calls, the kind that filled the gaps between real action. Then she saw it. A black luxury sedan glided through an intersection up ahead. Sleek, expensive, the kind of car that belonged in the driveway of a corporate executive, not on a near-empty street at this hour. Her eyes narrowed as the vehicle made a right turn. No signal. Technically, a violation. A minor one, sure, but rules were rules. Megan exhaled, setting down her coffee. It had been a slow night. Maybe too slow. With a flick of her wrist, she activated her lights and pulled onto the road. The red and blue glare reflected off the sedan's glossy exterior as it slowed to a smooth stop at the curb. Her pulse quickened. She wasn't sure why. Megan stepped out, one hand resting near her belt as she approached the driver's side. The night air was thick, the distant hum of the city a faint backdrop. The window rolled down deliberately slow, revealing the driver. A black man. Mid-40, neatly trimmed beard, tailored navy suit. He looked like someone who belonged in that car. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers barely twitching as he glanced at her. No nervous fidgeting, no frantic explanations. Megan felt something tighten in her chest. She didn't like the way he looked at her. Not nervous, not apologetic, just waiting. "License and registration," she said, her voice firmer than necessary. The man blinked once, then nodded slightly, before reaching for the glove compartment. Slow, controlled, careful, like he already knew what she was thinking. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" His voice was steady, measured. Megan crossed her arms. "Failure to signal back there." A beat passed. The faintest flicker of something unreadable crossed the man's face. "Did I?" he asked. Not defensive, not disrespectful, just calm. It bothered her. "License and registration," she repeated. The man handed over his ID and registration, his movements steady, precise. Megan barely glanced at his name, her focus instead on the way he carried himself. Too controlled, too confident, not afraid. And that made her uneasy. "You live around here?" she asked, her fingers tightening around his ID. A slow exhale, barely a sigh, but enough to feel like a statement. "I don't see how that's relevant." Her jaw clenched. She had been a cop for over a decade. She knew when someone wasn't taking her seriously, and that didn't sit well with her. "Step out of the vehicle." For the first time, the man's expression shifted. His jaw set. His head tilted slightly. "What?" Megan's grip on his ID tightened. "I asked you to step out." A muscle in his cheek twitched, but he didn't argue. He just sighed, unbuckled his seatbelt, and pushed the door open. Megan took a half-step back as he stood. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered. No tension in his stance, no aggression. But something about his presence made her pulse tick up a notch. She gestured toward the back of the car, hands on the trunk. A long pause. Then another slow, deliberate exhale. He turned, placing his palms flat against the cool metal. And Megan felt it. The shift. The moment where control changed hands. She wasn't sure why, but she didn't like it. The air felt heavier as Marcus Evans turned toward the trunk of his car, his movements slow and deliberate. His palms pressed flat against the cool metal, his posture steady, unwavering. Officer Megan Calloway stood behind him, her pulse still ticking too fast. Why? She told herself it was just routine, that she was in control. But standing there, looking at him, it didn't feel like control at all. Something about him, his calmness, his composure, unsettled her. "Spread your feet apart," she instructed, voice sharper than before. Marcus exhaled slowly but complied. Megan moved closer, her hand hovering near her holster. She didn't know why. She had stopped hundreds of drivers before, dealt with actual threats. But this felt different. Her fingers twitched. She hated that. She reached out, pressing a firm hand against his back. A small, subtle push, meant to reinforce that she was in charge here. And that was when something inside her snapped. Before she even registered the movement, her palm struck his face. A sharp, crisp slap, loud in the empty night. Marcus's head jerked slightly to the side. His body froze, his back still pressed against the car. The silence was immediate. Deafening. Megan's own breath hitched as reality crashed into her. What the hell did I just do? Her heartbeat roared in her ears as Marcus slowly turned his head back toward her. His face was stone-cold, unreadable. No anger, no shock, just watching her. Then, with excruciating patience, he reached into his jacket pocket. Megan's stomach twisted. Everything in her body screamed to react, to reach for her gun, to shout a command. But she was frozen, the weight of the moment suffocating. Marcus pulled out a thin leather wallet, flipping it open with quiet precision. He held it up, the silver badge catching the dim glow of the streetlights. Chief of Police, Marcus Evans. The blood drained from Megan's face. Her own boss. Her own damn chief. She stumbled back a step, her mind racing, trying to grasp the reality of what she had just done. Marcus held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, with the same unshakable calm, he tucked his ID back into his pocket. He didn't say anything. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't demand an explanation. And somehow that was so much worse. A set of headlights flooded the scene as another patrol car pulled up behind them. Officer Tom Reynolds. Megan's stomach tightened further. Oh God. She turned, forcing her face into neutrality as Reynolds approached. "Everything okay here, Calloway?" His voice was casual, but his eyes flicked between her and Marcus, suspicion already creeping in. Megan opened her mouth, but Marcus spoke first. "Fine," he said smoothly, adjusting his suit jacket like nothing had happened. "Your officer was just conducting a stop." Reynolds frowned slightly. "Sir, But Marcus didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Megan, pinning her in place. "Am I free to go, Officer Calloway?" The question landed like a hammer, knocking the breath out of her. Reynolds looked between them again, his confusion growing. Megan felt her throat dry up. Say yes, let him leave, hope he doesn't report it. Or double down, try to take back control. She licked her lips, pulse hammering. "Hiya." A low chuckle rumbled from Marcus's chest. Not amusement, not anger. Just something cold. "Officer Calloway," he said, voice dangerously even. "Are you detaining me?" The weight of Reynolds' stare burned into her. He hadn't seen it. He didn't know. She could still walk away. Megan swallowed hard. "No, sir." Marcus exhaled through his nose, giving a single nod. Then he turned, opened his car door, and slid back into his seat. No parting words. No threats. Just the eerie certainty that this was far from over. And as his sedan disappeared into the night, Megan felt it settle deep in her bones, the kind of fear that didn't fade. The kind that came when you knew your worst mistake was about to catch up with you. Megan barely slept that night. She lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over again. The way Marcus Evans had looked at her, the way he had let her go without a word, no yelling, no threats, just that silence. It was worse than if he had exploded in rage. By morning her stomach was knotted so tight it hurt. Maybe, just maybe, he had decided to let it go. Maybe this would just disappear. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. Her blood ran cold the moment she saw the message. Internal Affairs, report to the chief's office immediately. She sat up too fast, her breath catching in her throat. It was happening. The drive to the station felt like a slow-motion car crash. Every mile stretched endlessly, her grip on the wheel stiff and unyielding. When she finally pulled into the parking lot, she didn't move, just sat there, staring at the entrance. Then she noticed something. Officers stood in clusters near the break room windows. A few heads turned her way, then quickly looked away when they realized she had seen them. They knew. Word always got around. Megan forced herself to breathe, then pushed the door open. Her boots echoed against the tile as she walked inside. No one said anything, but she felt their eyes on her. The elevator ride to Marcus's office stretched unbearably long. Each second that passed tightened the noose around her lungs. Finally, she reached his door. A deep breath. Then she knocked. "Come in." Marcus's voice was steady, unreadable. Megan stepped inside. He sat behind his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up, but someone else was already there. Captain David Harmon. Internal Affairs. Shit. Harmon stood off to the side, arms crossed, expression impossible to read. The air in the room shifted. Finally, Marcus looked up. "Officer Calloway," he said evenly, his tone giving nothing away. "Sit." Megan's legs felt stiff as she lowered herself into the chair across from him. Marcus leaned back, clasping his hands together. A long pause. Then, "Tell me," he said, voice smooth but firm. "How would you report last night's stop?" Her throat felt dry. "Routine stop for failure to signal," she forced out. Marcus nodded, like he expected that answer. "And what happened next?" Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Asked for ID, the driver was—" she hesitated, "uncooperative." Marcus lifted a brow. "Uncooperative?" Megan's jaw clenched. He questioned why he was being stopped. A beat of silence. Marcus turned to Captain Harmon. "Would you say questioning an officer is considered uncooperative?" Harmon barely blinked. "Not unless the driver refuses to comply." Marcus's eyes slid back to her. "Did I refuse to comply, Officer Calloway?" Megan felt her hands dig into her thighs. "No, sir." Marcus exhaled through his nose. A slow nod. Then, the moment she had been dreading. She tried to keep her voice even. "I struck the suspect." Marcus's brow twitched. "Suspect?" Megan didn't answer. He studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward. "Why did you hit me, Officer Calloway?" The words sank into her like a hook. Harmon remained silent, his gaze heavy on her. Megan's lips parted, but nothing came out. Marcus's voice remained steady. "Did you feel threatened?" "No, sir." "Did I resist?" "No, sir." "Did I insult you?" Her stomach churned. Marcus held her gaze. "Then what exactly made you strike me?" The room felt too small, the walls too close. Her throat locked up. "You don't have an answer, Mark." He didn't yell, didn't call her a racist, didn't say anything she hadn't already thought about all night. Instead, he let the silence crush her. Finally, Marcus straightened. He took a breath, then slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Megan's heart stopped. "A suspension notice. You're off duty until further notice," he said simply. Megan's hands shook as she reached for it. "Chief Evans, I—" But he was already standing. Dismissed. Megan felt like she was sinking. She barely remembered how to walk. Her legs felt like they weren't attached to her body. She barely noticed Captain Harmon opening the door for her. But as she stepped out, Marcus spoke one last time. "We're not done." And she knew he meant it. Megan sat on her couch, staring at the suspension notice in her hands. She had read it at least 10 times, but the words never changed. Indefinite administrative leave, pending review. The weight of it settled in her chest. 15 years on the force, not a single suspension. And now, all she could do was wait. Her phone sat on the coffee table, silent. No calls, no texts. The usual chatter from fellow officers? Gone. Like she had been wiped clean from the department overnight. She told herself it was temporary, just a process. But deep down she knew how these things worked. Word had spread. They all knew. The worst part wasn't the silence, it was the waiting. Every hour that passed felt like another tightening knot in her stomach. Then, on the 4th day, her phone buzzed. Marcus Evans. Her pulse spiked. She hesitated for a half-second, fingers hovering over the screen. Then, finally, she answered. Calloway. A pause. Then, meet me at Riverside Park, 10 minutes. The call ended before she could even respond. Megan sat frozen, phone still clutched in her hand. What the hell was this? A second chance? A trap? Her gut told her to ignore it, but something heavier settled in her bones. So she grabbed her jacket and left. Riverside Park was nearly empty. A few joggers, a couple sitting on a bench, a man walking his dog. Streetlights flickered against the pavement, casting long shadows. And then she saw him. Marcus Evans. He stood near the water's edge, hands in his pockets, watching the river move beneath the bridge. He didn't look up as she approached. For a split second, Megan considered turning around and leaving. But she didn't. She stopped a few feet away. You called me. Marcus nodded, still not looking at her. Do you know why I didn't report you to Internal Affairs myself? The question caught her off guard. She had wondered that. Wondered why it had been handled quietly. Why he had let her walk away that night. Marcus finally turned to face her. Because I wanted you to sit with it first. Feel it. Megan's jaw tensed. I do. Marcus shook his head. No, you don't. His voice was level, but the weight behind it was undeniable. Megan crossed her arms. Then, what is this? Marcus studied her for a long moment, then nodded toward a bench. Sit. She hesitated, but something in his tone made it clear. This wasn't a request. So she sat. He followed, resting his elbows on his knees, staring out at the water. Then, he spoke. You ever been pulled over, Calloway? Megan blinked. A routine stop, Marcus clarified. Ever had a cop flash their lights at you, ask for your license, ask where you were going? She hesitated. I mean, maybe. Once or twice. Marcus exhaled through his nose. I lost count. Megan's stomach tightened. Every city I've lived in, he continued. I've had cops stop me, ask me why I was there, even in my own damn neighborhood. Megan didn't know what to say. Marcus leaned back against the bench. You hit me because you were frustrated. Megan stiffened. But Marcus wasn't done. Ask yourself why. Why was I frustrating you? She knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it. Marcus didn't let her off the hook. Because I didn't act afraid of you. Her chest tightened. You expected me to be nervous, to scramble for my wallet, to act like I was guilty of something. Marcus turned his head, locking eyes with her. And when I wasn't? Silence. It made you mad. Megan swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. Marcus shook his head. You don't see it, do you? She clenched her jaw. Not racist, Marcus finished for her. He didn't sound mocking, just tired. Maybe not. He nodded toward the river. But what do you call it when you assume someone's a threat just for existing? The words hit hard. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sound of the river, the distant hum of the city. Finally Marcus sighed. I didn't ask you here to tear you apart. Megan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then why am I here? Marcus stood. Because you got a choice to make. Megan frowned. What choice? Marcus turned toward her, his expression unreadable. You can walk away from this and tell yourself it was just a mistake. His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Or you can sit with it. Really sit with it, and ask yourself why it happened. Then, without another word, he walked away, leaving her alone with the truth. Megan spent the next 3 days drowning in silence. Her phone barely rang. No calls from the precinct, no texts from her usual work friends, no updates. It was like she had been erased. At first she told herself it was a relief. No awkward conversations, no stares from fellow officers, no judgment. But as the hours dragged on, the silence became suffocating. She tried to distract herself. TV, running, even cleaning her apartment until her hands ached. But nothing pushed away the thoughts. Marcus Evans's words stuck to her like oil, thick and impossible to wash off. You hit me because I didn't act afraid of you. She wanted to dismiss it, wanted to tell herself that wasn't true, that she had just made a bad call in the heat of the moment. But the more she thought about it, the more she knew he was right. And the worst part, she didn't even realize she had been thinking that way. It had been automatic, like breathing. The thought made her stomach churn. On the 4th morning, the call finally came. Internal Affairs, report in. Megan gripped the steering wheel tightly as she drove to the station. The sun was out, but it did nothing to shake the cold weight in her gut. The moment she stepped inside, she felt it again. The eyes. They didn't say anything. Didn't need to. By the time she reached the conference room, her palms were already clammy. Inside, 3 people sat waiting. Captain David Harmon, IA investigator Lauren Harris, and Marcus Evans. He didn't look at her, just kept his hands folded on the table, staring at the file in front of him. Megan swallowed hard and sat down. Harris leaned forward. Officer Calloway, let's talk about the stop from last week. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Yes, sir. Harris flipped through the papers. According to your statement, you pulled the driver over for a failure to signal. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Harris nodded. And at what point did you escalate to physical force? Her stomach twisted. She could feel Marcus's presence across the table, his silence just as loud as the question itself. Megan exhaled, her voice barely above a whisper. I struck the driver, after asking him to step out of the vehicle. Harris's brow lifted slightly. Wait, she had rehearsed this in her head 100 times, but every excuse, every justification suddenly felt hollow. Her lips pressed together. I lost my temper. Captain Harmon shifted in his chair. Harris blinked, as if he hadn't expected her to say it so plainly. Flipping to another page, he continued, You wrote here that you felt the driver was being uncooperative. Megan's hands curled into fists under the table. She exhaled. I assumed he was resisting when he wasn't. For the first time, Marcus looked up. Their eyes met. Assumed, he repeated. Megan felt the weight of that word. Silence stretched between them. Then Harris cleared his throat. Chief Evans, do you have anything to add? Marcus sat back in his chair, studying her. Then exhaled. Not yet. Harris closed the file. Officer Calloway, here's where we are. You've been on the force for 15 years with no prior disciplinary action. That works in your favor. However, this was an unjustified use of force. That's not something we can ignore. Megan felt her pulse pick up. Harris continued, You are looking at a minimum suspension of 60 days without pay. Additionally, you will be required to attend de-escalation and bias training. A second offense of this nature will result in termination. Megan let out a slow breath. It wasn't good news, but it wasn't the end either. She nodded. Understood. Harris stood, gathering his files. We'll finalize the paperwork. You're dismissed. Megan rose from her seat. Marcus didn't move. He watched her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she reached the door, he finally spoke. "Calloway." She stopped. Marcus's voice was calm, even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. "This isn't over." Megan didn't turn around. She just gripped the doorknob, forcing herself to breathe, because deep down she knew he was right, and the real work hadn't even started yet. The first day of training was humiliating. Megan sat in a small, windowless room with a dozen other officers. Some were rookies, others veterans like her. No one spoke much. No one wanted to be here. At the front of the room stood Joanna Pierce, a retired detective. Black woman, early 60s. Sharp eyes that missed nothing. She didn't introduce herself, didn't waste time. She clicked the remote in her hand and the projector flickered to life. A traffic stop video played. Body cam footage. Megan watched in silence. A black man pulled over for a minor infraction. The officer, white, spoke sharply. Tension built. The driver kept his hands visible, his voice calm. But it didn't matter. The officer's frustration grew. Then, an unnecessary escalation, a grab, a shove, a takedown. The room stayed silent as the video ended. Joanna crossed her arms. "Let's talk about assumptions." No one answered. She let the silence stretch. Then her eyes landed on Megan. "Officer Calloway." Megan felt every set of eyes turn to her. Joanna tilted her head toward the blank screen. What did the officer see when he pulled that man over? Megan's throat tightened. She knew the answer. She just didn't want to say it. Joanna waited. Megan exhaled. "A threat." Joanna nodded. "And what did you see when you pulled over Chief Evans?" The room went still. Megan's breath felt heavy. Her fingers curled into fists under the table. She forced the words out. "A threat." Joanna didn't react. Didn't praise her for the admission. Just watched her. Then asked the question that cut the deepest. "Was he?" Megan looked away. Her jaw clenched. Her stomach twisted. "No." Joanna took a step forward. Then where did that idea come from? The words hit like a hammer. Where had it come from? The training, the way officers talked in the locker room, the subtle messages absorbed over years of police work. Megan had spent her whole career telling herself she was fair, that she treated everyone the same. But that night with Marcus had proven something she didn't want to admit. That it wasn't true. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't looking away from the question. Joanna held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded. Good. Megan let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Because for the first time since that night, she wasn't fighting the truth. She was facing it. 60 days later, Officer Megan Calloway walked back into the precinct. The station hummed with the usual chaos, phones ringing, boots against tile, the low murmur of officers exchanging reports. But there was something different. She felt the weight of their eyes as she passed. Not judgment, not hostility, just watching. She wasn't sure if that was better or worse. Her desk looked the same as when she had left. Papers stacked neatly, chair tucked under. Like the past 2 months hadn't happened at all. She set her things down, exhaled. Then a shadow passed by. Marcus Evans. He walked past her without stopping. But right as he reached his office door, he paused, turned his head slightly. "Calloway." She straightened. "Sir." A beat of silence. Then, "Welcome back." Her fingers curled against the desk. "Thank you." Marcus nodded once, then disappeared into his office, door clicking shut behind him. For the first time in weeks, Megan breathed. It wasn't over. It never would be. But this was a start. That evening, as the station emptied, Megan sat at her desk, staring at her badge. She turned it over in her hands. It felt heavier than before. She had spent 15 years believing she was a good cop, that she had been different, that the way she handled herself was above reproach. And then, in a single night, Marcus had ripped that belief apart. Not by yelling, not by punishing her outright, but by forcing her to sit with it. Really sit with it. She glanced toward his office. His light was still on. She hesitated. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she stood up, walked across the station, knocked twice. "Come in." Marcus was at his desk, flipping through a file. He didn't look up right away. When he did, his expression was unreadable. Megan stepped inside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." Marcus leaned back in his chair. "Good." Megan exhaled. "I don't know if I have all the answers yet." Marcus studied her. "You won't, not for a long time." She nodded. Then, quieter. "But I'm trying." Marcus didn't answer right away. Then he gave a slow, approving nod. "That's a start." Megan swallowed, then turned toward the door. But before she left, Marcus spoke again. "Calloway." She glanced back. "It's not just about what happens on the job." Megan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Marcus held her gaze. "It's about what you do when no one's watching." The words sat heavy in the room. Megan didn't respond. Didn't know how to respond. Instead, she just nodded and walked out. This wasn't over. But for the first time, she knew where to begin. Prejudice isn't always loud. It doesn't always come in the form of slurs or overt hate. Sometimes it's subtle. It's the quiet assumptions, the split-second judgments we make without even realizing it. Megan Calloway wasn't a bad cop in her own mind. She believed she was fair. She believed she treated everyone the same. Until one night, one bad decision, one moment of unchecked bias, proved otherwise. This story isn't just about her, it's about all of us. We all have blind spots. We all have assumptions we don't even recognize, until we're forced to confront them. The real question isn't whether or not bias exists. The real question is, are we willing to face it? And if we are, what will we do about it? Marcus Evans didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He made Megan sit with it. And that's what this story challenges all of us to do. To sit with it. To ask the hard questions. To be honest about the answers. Because change doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in the choices we make when no one is watching. What are your thoughts? Do you think Megan truly changed? Or was this just another cop going through the motions? Have you ever caught yourself making a quick judgment about someone before realizing you were wrong? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about this. Like the video if it made you think. Share it if you believe more people need to hear this message. Subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives. Let's have the conversations that actually matter.